Hi, for this lesson, where we're thinking about why we get fossils preserved as they are, I thought it was a good idea to start by looking at this. This is a close-up of a very famous type of limestone called Portland Limestone. It's used for a lot of public buildings, including some of the big public buildings in the middle of Cardiff. It's very white, very pure limestone. If you look carefully at it, though, we can see these features within it. Clearly, they're fossils. But what are we actually seeing here? How are these fossils actually preserved within the rock? This lesson is all about the different processes that lead to the preservation of fossils. How we actually go from a living organism to the trace of life that we find within a rock. Now, there's a number of different things we need to consider. For example, if you look at this, these are different fossils that can be found in Lyme Regis in Dorset, one of the most famous fossil hunting locations in the UK. You'll notice these fossils are different from the ones we've just seen in the Portland limestone, also on the south coast of England. What's different about them? How are these preserved differently from the fossils that we've just seen in the Portland limestone? The difference between them is perhaps illustrated best by looking at this manufacture of a replica of a fossil. Because we need to think about fossils as whether they're preserved as either a mould or a cast of the fossil. So a mould is a negative impression left after an organism has decayed away. So we have a feature that can be fossilized, say a shell that's buried in the mud, buried within the rock, and it leaves an imprint in the mud. If that shell then dissolves away, it'll leave behind this negative impression. That negative impression then can be filled up with other mineral material. Now in this case, we've got plaster of Paris that was used. Fills up that mould and creates a positive impression of the fossil. This is what we call a cast. So if we go back and look at this Portland limestone that we started with, you can see that what we actually have here is an imprint of the original fossils. So there's a gap, a space where that shell was. The features of that shell are actually preserved as this negative impression in the limestone. But the original shell material, all the original animal, has gone. That shell material has been dissolved away by groundwater passing through the rock. This creates a mould of the fossil. A cast then is where we get a mould that gets infilled with other minerals. So what we see then is often a very solid representation of the original shell material. And we can see different minerals that get deposited in these moulds to fill up the original cavity left by the shell to create a cast of the fossil. There are several different minerals that where we see this. But this process is called petrification. It means turning into stone, literally. The minerals that fill this up will preserve certainly the outside structure of the fossil, and even, as is the case with these petrified trees, where this replacement has happened very gradually over time, we even see the internal structure of the fossils. Now, there are three common minerals that we find replacing these the original shell material. Calcite is very common. Calcite is perhaps the trickiest one to recognise as being replaced, because a lot of original shell material will also be calcite. But for example, if you find a fossil of a shell and the whole fossil is solid, then that's going to have been replaced, because there's no space for the animal to live. We can also find fossils that are preserved by quartz, described as being silicified. Now, there are very few organisms that have silica shells. So if we find an animal that normally has a calcite shell but preserved as quartz, we know that that's been replaced. These can often make some amazing fossils, particularly in limestone, where the limestone dissolves away and it leaves the more resistant silica or silicified fossil standing proud of the rock surface. The final one of these minerals is pyrite. Now, pyrite or fool's gold can form the cast of a fossil, and it can create beautiful gold-coloured fossils. Now, there's no animal at all that naturally will have a pyrite shell. So if we find pyrite, we know that mineral has been replaced. There are some other methods as well. This is carbonisation. Now, carbonisation is commonly how plants are preserved. So a plant will get buried in the rock, compaction, a bit of heat, drives off any hydrogen, oxygen, any other water, anything else that might be actually in the plant. What's left is just the carbon. So we end up with this thin black film in the rock, almost like a very tiny layer of coal. Now, there are some other less common methods of fossils, of fossilization, that preserve fossils in very, very unique circumstances. Refrigeration is one of them. Now, refrigeration only really applies to very recent fossils. These are quaternary fossils, for example, in places like Siberia. And we have found, for example, woolly mammoth fossils remarkably well preserved, frozen into the ice. This is Dima, found in Siberia, a juvenile mammoth, incredibly well preserved. But these fossils aren't going to be old. We can't find really ancient fossils preserved in ice. Another unusual example is where we get fossils preserved in amber. Amber is a fossil tree resin, I suppose a fossil in itself. But this resin, the sticky resin, gets exuded from certain species of conifers. If you have insects then landing on that amber, they get stuck. The amber then will flow over the insect, excluding all the oxygen and preserving these fossils perfectly. But we only find it in particular species and in particular areas as well. Another example is mummification. Mummification is literally dehydration. If in the desert environment, an animal desiccates, it dries out before it gets buried, we can see features like skin, perhaps internal tissue preserved. The example in the bottom left here, Leonardo, is a dinosaur that was desiccated, was mummified before it was buried. So it can be quite exceptional preservation, but it is very unusual. We can find other types of fossils or subfossils preserved in environments where oxygen is excluded. Oxygen leads to decomposition, which leads to the destruction of a fossil. So if we have anaerobic conditions, for example, in waterlogged peat bogs, we can have fossils preserved. Pollen grains, for example, that we can get from cores taken from peat bogs give us good environmental indications. We can even find some extremely well preserved fossil human skeletons, complete with skin, complete in some cases with stomach contents. Another environment that excludes oxygen are tar pits, where you get hydrocarbon seeps spilling crude oil at the surface naturally. These can trap animals from the past. It covers them in asphalt and will exclude oxygen and preserve them very, very well. One of the most famous ones of these is in Los Angeles, a place called the La Brea Tar Pits, where a very wide range of fossils from the Quaternary period have been found. So, from this we can see there are several different ways in which fossils can be preserved. The key ones, though, that create most of the fossils we look at, and certainly the ones you need to be aware of for exams, are petrification, in terms of moulds and casts, and carbonisation. Those two account for the vast majority of fossils, and certainly the vast majority of fossils that we need to be aware of.